Noah's Ark in Ziusudra epic. Sumerian origins of the flood myth. Hello, we are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and via this video we are venturing back in time to the very beginning, eon, era or age past, to discover exactly where all of the biblical stories of a great flood or deluge began, and also the creation story and others as well to follow, to verify once and for all if all the biblical stories were from original ancient very old myths in the original ancient very old languages or scripts, now long dead, no longer written or spoken, and were over the millenniums that followed, adopted and adapted from tales of men by men, and made more palatable or easier to grasp and understand, and they deemed them all as true historical happenings or events, all stemming from one monotheistic or even a pantheon of multiple gods and goddesses that they may say actually exist today in the heavenly or a heavenly realm. A monotheistic or a pantheon of gods is what we're referring to. And all men of that day and to follow were persuaded by others to accept all as 100% true historical events, true events, things that happened through many means, repetitious retellings of those stories, tradition, culture, indoctrination, enculturation, force, threat, fear, threat of depravity or loss or punishment or death for disbelief. So we're going to have a look at this particular book by Robert M. Best, Noah's Ark and the Ziusudra epic. Abstract. This is a reconstruction of a lost legend about Ziusudra, Noah, also known as Eterhasis, Na in Palestinian Hebrew, etc., who was king of the Sumerian city-state Shuruppak at the end of the Jemdet Sippar period about 2900 BC. A 6-day thunderstorm caused the Euphrates River to rise and flood Shuruppak and a few other cities in southern Sumer. The Ark was a commercial river barge that was hauling grain, beer and other cargo, including a few hundred animals, when the storm began. The runaway barge floated down the river into the Persian Gulf, where it is grounded in an estuary at the mouth of the river. Ziusudra then offered a sacrifice at the top of a hill, which storytellers misunderstood as mountain. This led to them to assume that the nearby barge had grounded on the top of a mountain. The flood myth is mythologized with emphasis on what was physically possible, technologically practical and consistent with archaeological facts. Short abstract. A reconstruction of a lost legend about Ziusudra, Noah, a Sumerian king whose cattle barge got caught in a local river flood about 2900 BC. About the author Robert MacAndrew Best, born in Pennsylvania and received a BS degree in physics from Carnegie Mellon University. The cover scene is an artist's conception of the flood. Heroes sacrificed after the flood is described in Genesis 8:20 and line 156 of tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Quote, I placed an offering at the top of a hill like ziggurat. Unquote. This was an animal sacrifice on a fireplace, a primitive altar at the top of a ziggurat at the temple of Enki in the city of Eridu. A high priestess is holding up her lapis lazuli, large fly's amulet of power, and is blessing the food before giving permission to the priest to eat the sacrificial offering. The priests have shaved heads and wool skirts as shown in Sumerian art. Noah in the foreground also has a shaved head and wool skirts because he was made an honorary priest after the flood. Noah's hands are folded in reverence as seen from the top of the ziggurat. The city of Eridu is artistically depicted in the distance next to a branch of the Euphrates River. This imagery is inferred from a mythical part of the flood story and may or may not have happened. So we'll have a look at that picture again. Here's the looks like a high priestess and priests. There'll be Noah, animal sacrifice, and it's probably Eridu in the background there in that particular illustration. Contents page. Illustrations and maps, tables, acknowledgements, credits, preface. Of all the stories in the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah's Ark is one of the most famous. More than 100 books have been written about Noah, the flood, the Ark, the animals, and Mount Ararat, and several movies have been based on the flood story. The Noah's Ark story holds a fascination for people of all ages and has enjoyed discussion and popular storytelling for more than 3 millennia. A continuing controversy exists between various groups of people regarding the Noah's Ark story and the Genesis flood. Mythologists and skeptics believe the flood story is entirely fiction because many of the reported or implied events, such as global flood, would have been physically impossible. Ark searching mountain climbers and young earth creationists believe that Noah's Ark, or Noah's flood, was global because only a global flood could cover high mountains. Biblical and ancient Near East scholars generally reject the creationist fantasies, but some scholars consider the flood story worthy of a serious study. We have a book called The Timetables of History, page 3, column B. It states that disastrous floods happened in the Mesopotamian region in a certain period. Minus 1500 or something like that, or minus 2005, whatever it was, BC. Biblical and ancient Near East scholars generally reject the creationist fantasies, but some scholars consider the flood story worthy of serious study. Much of the flood story is mythical and the entire story may have been fiction, but some of the plausible details may have been based on real events that were mythologized by later poets and storytellers. This book attempts to separate the legendary parts from the mythical parts and to reconstruct some of the events that may have occurred during a local flood that inspired the mythical stories that survive to the present or modern times. After removing the myth from the Sumerian, Babylonian, Genesis and Berossus versions of the story, that would be the Greek, this author has combined the remaining legendary fragment into one coherent story, while emphasizing what would have been physically possible, technologically practical and consistent with archaeological facts. Each legendary story element is checked for possible scribal errors, mistranslations, misunderstandings, exaggerations and other distortions of the text, because these are the kinds of distortions usually found in orally transmitted legend, or verbally, right? Passed down, repeated. Somebody makes a mistake, it's like Chinese whispers. Someone gets it wrong, and at the end you got a completely different story from the original that was being told. Each detail is interpreted in the context of what witnesses of a local flood could have seen with their own eyes from their limited perspective. Subjective opinions of the narrators are replaced with more plausible explanations for alleged events. Writing a book that rationalized the Genesis flood story was not initially the author's intent. Instead, as a pastime, he was attempting to decipher the numbers in Genesis 5, an effort that was finally successful. You'd have to look at chapter 7 within the book. Having a physical science background, he initially had no interest in the flood story because he knew it was impossible for the ocean to cover Mount Ararat only 5,000 years ago. But to decipher the numbers in Genesis 5:1, he needed to understand the numbers in Genesis 7:6 and 9:28. And that got him involved in the flood story. Under the conventional notion that the ark landed on a mountain, the story did not make sense. But the author kept inventing alternative theories, and eventually the pieces began to fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw picture puzzle. This led him to thoroughly research the remaining holes in the puzzle. As more and more of the pieces fit together, a new picture emerged that was surprisingly different than anything he'd ever seen or read before or since. This book is the result and provides a fresh viewpoint for understanding the flood myth that was not previously available. And the author was not presuming that there was a historical basis for the major elements in the Noachian flood myth. Even if the original legend was based on an actual river flood, the boatload of animals may have been fiction. And even if an actual cattle barge got caught in an actual river flood, the story elements linking the barge owner to the king of Shuruppak may have been fiction. There is no way to determine how much of the flood legend was fiction and how much was fact. Therefore, the author's objective was not to prove the historicity of the flood myths, rather it was his objective to reconstruct as much as possible the original legend, regardless of what percentage was fiction or fact. Several ambiguous words in the flood myths can be given physically possible and plausible meanings. But are usually given impossible meanings because of ancient mistakes, centuries of tradition, and uncritical storytelling. To clear away the misunderstandings and mistranslations that have grown like barnacles on the original legend, it is essential to focus on what was physically possible and practical in the early 3rd millennium BC. Facts about the Euphrates River annually rising and falling provide a chronological foundation for reconstructing the events on which the flood legend was based. Archaeological evidence provides essential facts for linking legendary story elements to the real world. The author has filled some of the gaps in the story with conjecture, but this conjecture may be disregarded without weakening the basic theory. Some of these conjectures led to hypotheses that were confirmed by other data in the sources or by archaeological facts. This book, therefore, is for people who would like to know the historical basis of Noah's flood story, but who know the story is mostly myth. The historicity of the flood story remains unproven, but the events reconstructed here within the book would have been physically possible, and some may have happened, although under circumstances that were different than what is commonly believed. Author Robert M. Best. Summary of conclusions. The ancient Near East flood myths, including the one in Genesis, were adaptations of one archetype flood myth that was first written in clay about 2600 BC. This archetype flood myth was based on legends about a local flood of the Euphrates River that occurred about 2900 BC in southern Sumer, now southern Iraq. The flood hero in the archetype myth was based on Ziusudra, who was king of the Sumerian city-state of Shuruppak at the time of the river flood, at the beginning of the early dynastic period. The ark was based on a commercial river barge used for transporting cargo on the Euphrates River. This river barge was about 200 feet long and held less than 280 animals, along with thousands of baskets of grain and jars of beer and wine that were being transported to market. A 6-day thunderstorm caused the river to rise about 15 cubits above the levees and resulted in a local flooding of Shuruppak and a few other Sumerian cities. The swollen river carried the runaway cattle barge downriver into the relatively deep water of the Persian Arabian Gulf. The castle barge drifted about the Gulf for several months and finally grounded in the mud on an estuary at the mouth of the rivers at sea level. After disembarking, the flood hero Ziusudra, Noah, offered a sacrifice at the top of a nearby hill, which storytellers mistranslated as mountain. This led them to erroneously assume that the barge had grounded on the top of a mountain. There were many survivors of the river flood, and Ziusudra met some of them after the barge grounded. About 300 years later, orally transmitted mythical versions of the flood story were written in clay and included several mistranslations and misunderstandings of the original local flood legends. In the original legends, Ziusudra did not know a flood was coming until rain began to fall. The cattle barge never came close to a mountain. The so-called Mount Ararat was not involved, as there was no global deluge. The impossibly large numbers in Genesis 5 and the Sumerian king list resulted from ancient mistranslations of the original numbers. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the original ancient, very old Tav Asheret, Brita, in the Aramaic, which was originally in the Lishana Attica Cypriot, the sacred scribal language spoken by God to Adam and Eve. Translated into the nearest English equivalent by native-born Aramaic, translated filmmaker from Mesopotamia, Syria, Victor Nimrod Alexander. I'm going to have a look at that. Brita or Genesis chapter 5. Okay, let's go through all about Adam. Genesis 6. Genesis 7. God said to Noah, enter into the ark, you and all your household, because I have noticed that you are the only righteous person before me in this century, in that age, right? In that era. And from every pure animal, taken 7 pairs, etc., etc. And at the end of the 7th eon, it's not a day, it's a era, an age, right? Could have been several years. The flood waters were on the earth. After the 600 years of Noah's age, okay, in the 17th day of the second month. So what it's saying here is 600 years later, this guy with Noah was born, all this sort of stuff, and men were like the children of God or the sons of God, those who called upon his name. They turned their back on him because they saw that these women of the human beings, probably the Neanderthals or cavemen dwellers, hunter-gatherers or whatever, that were pre-Adamic, right? They were created before Adam and Eve, in the image of God. They had his face, his facades. They weren't created of the soil, as Adam and Eve apparently were. So they grabbed their daughters and married whoever they wanted, right? According to this Brita in the Aramaic, or this original Genesis in English, translated by 15 hours done. They got together with them, right? And they ended up having hybrids, half breeds, or this sort of stuff, mixed breeds. So this flood happens 600 years later or something. It's coming up by the looks of it. In his day, at a certain age, Noah was, right? I'm not saying he was 600 years old, as in your Americanized English versions. Like it says Adam died at 930 is actually incorrect. It's actually talking about his lineage, his line of descendants, those who came from his seed, right? His children, descendants. Okay, because obviously his son Seth, who replaced Abel, because Cain killed Abel, he had his own sons, right? And that was a different continuing lineage until his oldest son became the chief, the head of the tribe, and then he had a lineage of descendants and carried on. Okay, so it's talking about Noah and the flood and all the details. Here it says there was a flood for 40 days on the earth, and the water swelled and lifted the ark and floated above the earth, and so forth. Genesis 8 recalls Noah, and it was in the 601st year, on the first of the month, that the waters dried off the earth, and Noah crossed the threshold of the cover to the ark, and he looked out and saw that the surface of the earth was dry, etc. And God says, go out, everybody get out. And then Noah builds an altar to the Lord, and he consecrates it, right? The produce of every pure creature and of every pure bird, etc., etc. Probably the offspring of them, right? Of every bird and animal, etc. born within that ark, as a small holocaust or sacrifice. He raised them to the altar as the Holocaust. It's not talking about the disastrous one in World War II. This is Aramaic for small or Holocaust, sacrifice, right? On an altar. And the Lord smells it and he says, oh, that's great, etc., etc. And he promises, makes his covenant through Noah, I will not allow again for the earth to be cursed because of humanity, for the arm of the human heart is evil from its young days, etc., etc. So that particular place is Kardu. 8-4, literal Aramaic name, Kardu or Ararat, because he's translating it also from the 3,000 year older Mesopotamian cuneiform text or manuscripts text. Further up, we believe it says the ark rested on a mountain. See, here it is here. Genesis 6 Urei Ta, the Hebrew version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we believe it says here somewhere the ark rested on the mountain of apes. Where is it? I'm trying to find it here in the footnotes. Okay, so look at 9 to 12. Yeah, no, it's not here. Some of his translations he leaves things out and you find them in another one, right? Like Genesis 1:31, where it says the animals were seldom sacrificed or eaten. Adam and Eve were allowed to use their byproducts like milk to make cheese, curd, whatever they did, whatever they ate. Especially on his translation project, it seems to be left out. You may find it in his published translation if you buy it. So going back to the book, myths, legends and history. Every year in December, millions of otherwise rational people speak and sing about an overweight man in a red and white suit, talking about Santa Claus. The problem of separating myths from the legends in Noah's flood, the legend of Noah's flood story, is similar to the problem of separating the Santa Claus myth from the legend of Saint Nicholas. Without pushing the analogy too far, Santa Claus is mentioned here because it is well known that the myth and the legend are separable. It is easy to discuss the legend of Archbishop Nicholas without getting entangled in the Santa Claus myth, because the names are different and much of the myth was created recently. The modern image of Santa Claus was largely invented or compiled by writer Washington Irving, poet Clement Moore and cartoonist Thomas Nast during the 19th century. The problem of separating the myths from the legends in Noah's flood is similar to the problem of separating the Santa Claus legend of Saint Nicholas of Myra, Turkey. If we were to prepare a plausible case that Saint Nicholas really existed, we would first have to remove the myths about flying reindeer and chimney climbing. If the remaining legendary material could be confirmed, a history of Saint Nicholas might be developed, but developing reliable history is not always possible from surviving legends. Historians require documentation for alleged historical facts that can stand up to various tests and proofs for accuracy. Unsubstantiated folklore, saga, epic, poetry, etc. do not qualify as history. Unless we could find contemporaneous documents such as church records that attest to essential details of Nicholas's life, we would not be able to prove the historicity of Saint Nicholas. The best we could hope for would be a plausible but unconfirmed legend. Separating myth from legend. Separating the myth from the legend, if any, in the ancient Near East. Flood story is more difficult because thousands of years have passed since the original flood legends were first written down, during which time many of the details have become garbled. From a comparison of various versions of the flood story, it is clear that several poets, storytellers, writers and editors have altered details and added new material during transmission of the stories. Moreover, we have no way of knowing whether the original flood stories were partly fictional or entirely fictional and based only on general knowledge of the original authors. Myths usually involve physically impossible supernatural events because miracles are entertaining and memorable. Storytellers who want to entertain rather than report facts add mythical material to their received story whenever it suits their needs. In myths, animals talk, gods intervene, people or things get magically transformed, superheroes do impossible things and have knowledge they could not possibly have. Physical details such as distances, forces, strengths, velocities, heights and sizes are exaggerated to impossible degrees, and physical objects and forces are given human-like emotions. The storyteller who is not interested in historical accuracy substitutes fantasy for anything he does not understand or cannot remember. Usually, impossible and exaggerated parts of the story are easy to recognize, but there is no guarantee that the remaining plausible details are factual, even if the legendary parts of the story were based on actual events. A legend is a story about a subject that is believed to have been historical but cannot be verified. Legends concern named heroes, specific places and possible events in the past, but some or all of the legend may be fiction. For example, some of the stories about King Arthur, such as the Battle of Camlann where Arthur was said to have been fatally wounded, could have happened, or that many other Arthurian tales could not have happened. Even though the Battle of Camlann seems possible, it is also possible that Arthur was not at the battle, or the battle was fiction. Until a contemporaneous document or artifact is found that provides detail about the Battle of Camlann, the story that seems true may be fiction, will remain legendary. It goes on about the Trojan War being another example. Even though legends can quickly become myths through fantasy and inaccurate transmission, certain details of a legend may continue to be retold by generations of storytellers exactly as they heard them, because some of their listeners have heard the story before and expect the details to be repeated accurately. The details that are found in two or more versions of the flood story, such as the bird scene and the altar scene, identify these stories as variations of the same story and increase the probability that these stories have a common origin. But as we shall see, some of the common details in different versions of the story were mistakes made during oral transmission, or verbally, or during translation from Sumerian to Akkadian. Legendary stories can quickly become historical if and when credible documents or artifacts are found. Searching for such evidence is therefore a legitimate activity, although it is understandable that historians do not want to waste their time on myth-tainted legendary stories that are probably fiction, and so forth. Most historians and many biblical scholars believe that nothing historical or legendary can be found in the Genesis flood story. If the events or numbers in a story are impossible or very improbable, it would seem foolish as well as futile to look for historical or legendary material in such stories. Demythologizing a myth. Three methods of demythologizing the flood story are used here in the book to uncover underlying legend. The first method is to disregard every phrase that contains obvious mythical material or conflicts with known facts. The phrases that remain are the legend, although this method yields only a few disconnected fragments of legend. The second method is to reinterpret each impossible or improbable phrase as a mistake and seek alternative interpretations that conform to what would have been physically possible and plausible before rejecting the phrase as myth. Excluding the supernatural, some reported events that are impossible or improbable can be corrected for mistranslations, exaggerations, misunderstandings, mistaken identifications, and similar errors if plausible causes can be found for such errors. The third method is to reinterpret phrases that are clearly mythical as a storyteller's mythical interpretation of legendary events. This third method is clearly unreliable because new interpretations of mythical material may be only the fantasy of the interpreter. Such reinterpreted myth is not used here within the book to develop the basic theory, but is used sparingly to flesh out the story when constrained by a theory based on a non-myth legend. The first and second methods provide the essential evidence from which a basic framework of the theory is built. This theory then guides interpretation of the mythical material. Reported facts imply other facts. Some facts can be inferred from the received text because one fact follows from another fact. For example, the received statement of the Sumerian Noah, or Ziusudra, was a king or chief executive of Shuruppak implies several things about his personality and activities. Being a king implies he was probably wealthy, he controlled many people, he delegated responsibility, he was involved in diplomatic relations with foreign states, he was interested in increasing the wealth of Shuruppak, he had rivals, he did not build boats with his own hands, etc. Although these inferences are conjecture, they are more plausible than guesses about an ancient storyteller's agenda. Ark's story is myth and legend, not history. It was not the author's objective in this book to prove the historicity of Noah's Ark. That is not possible without confirmation from contemporaneous artifacts, but it was also not his objective to dismiss the flood myths as entirely fictional. Rather, his objective was to present a demythologized legend, an alternative version of the story that is based on archaeological, geographical and meteorological facts and therefore would have been physically possible and may have happened. Or if some of the reconstructed legend was fiction, the legend may approximate some fictional biographies about the Sumerian legend, about the Sumerian Noah, that were mythologized by ancient storytellers and epic poets. In most instances, the author's statements express probability and plausibility, not certainty. The arguments and the conclusions presented in this book should be viewed as hypotheses to be revised as additional evidence is discovered. Versions of the flood story. Nobody ever sees truth except in fragments. Henry Ward Beecher, 1887. 6 versions of the flood story are analysed here within the book and combined into one coherent story, although numerous flood stories exist from around the world. The 6 selected here within the book are the most ancient, are from a geographically small area, the ancient Near East, and share many common story elements. 1. The Ziusudra epic was written in the Sumerian language and only one fragmented copy of this text survives. These fragments, which include only about 1/3 of the original text, were found at the site of the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur in the southern valley of the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. Anciently it was called Erech, E-R-E-C-H. The fragments were part of a large library in the temple of Enlil and had been dated to around 1600 BC. Ziusudra was the flood hero in this abridged version of the flood myth. 2. The Atrahasis epic was written in Akkadian and only about 2/3 of the original text survives. It was found in 2 different editions at the site of the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh in the library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, 669 to 633 BC. Remember that in the story, biblical story, Jonah went to Nineveh and warned those Assyrians, those Ninevites, the wrath of God is coming upon you, repent, 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 and the king believed everything he said about his God, and they all converted, put on sackcloth, chucked dirt over themselves, even the animals, and believed. Nineveh was in the northern end of the Tigris River Valley. The earlier and most complete edition was copied during the reign of Amizabduga, the next to the last king of the old Babylonian period, about 1636 BC, during a period when Sumerian literature was being collected and translated into Akkadian by scribes in Babylonia. Atrahasis was the flood hero in this version of the flood myth, because Ashurbanipal was a clay tablet worm. He collected all of those stories. He sent out emissaries, agents, to collect them, whether they were copies or they preferred the originals, but he was happy with them bringing back copies. And he created this giant library. That's the same person that did it, which was when the Nineveh was invaded, it was destroyed, covered under dirt for thousands of years, and Henry Layard and Rasmud, or some name like that, found it, dug it up, and shipped about 50,000 of those tablets, complete ones, broken ones, etc., or shattered ones, to the English or the British Museum, and apparently George Smith helped him to translate into English. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, number 3, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story forms a major part of Tablet 11, usually labelled XI or X1 in modern translations. The Gilgamesh epic consists of 12 poems of about 300 lines each. Each poem was written on a separate tablet. The flood story was added to an earlier edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh, about 1200 BC, by an editor, perhaps Sin-Liki Unini. The most complete copy was written in Akkadian and was also found in the library of Ashurbanipal. Several fragmented copies survive in the Akkadian, Middle Babylonian, Hittite and Hurrian languages. The people long dead, no longer written and spoken languages, right? Quotations used here or in the book are from various English translations of the Tablet 11, unless otherwise specified, or X1. XI. The hero of the flood was named Utnapishtim in this version of the flood myth. 4. Genesis 6-9 in Hebrew. The Genesis version of the flood story reached its present form during the post-exilic period between 400 BC. The Revised Standard Version is used herein, also in the book, except where noted. This is a modern English translation, or the latter Americanized English version or translation, from the Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew text. The Septuagint, ancient Greek translation from the Hebrew version of the Genesis 5 genealogy, is analysed in chapter 7 within this book. 5. The Berossus version in Greek. Berossus was a Babylonian priest of the god Marduk and wrote a history of Babylonia that was published about 281 BC. This history has not survived, but excerpts of his version of the flood story were preserved by a few later writers, including Josephus, who they say, well, top theologians, Bad-tibira, etc. You can't really be trusted because it looks like someone's added some to his writings, right? Because there's a difference in style from Josephus, right? There's a difference there, noticeable difference. So not too sure about that guy, right? Polyhistor Eusebius, another one that they maybe exaggerated, can't be trusted. And Syncellus. The flood hero is named Ziusudra. 6. The Moses of Korea version of the flood story was published in his History of Armenia in Armenian about the 8th century CE. He cited a legend from Olympiodorus regarding a book about Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, and his sons, which has not survived to the present. Although the legend about the flood that Moses of Korea recorded does not mention events before grounding of the boat, he does mention some events after the grounding. In addition, the Sumerian king list WB-62 mentions the flood and the flood hero Ziusudra. The king list has impossibly large numbers of years for each king, but these numbers are deciphered in chapter 7 of this book. Numerous other ancient versions of the flood story were studied in preparing the present book, including Old Testament Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. That means it's pseudo, it's not, probably not actually real, you know. It's very mythical, or someone's written at a later date, so it's not necessarily fraudulent, it's just someone's writing in another style, etc, etc, or trying to copy the style of somebody else, as people did in St. Paul's day, and he put a special key there to know, so people know that he actually wrote those letters, because apparently 6 or 7 of his 13 letters were written by him, the rest were fake, or pseudepigrapha. and he knew about this. In addition, the Sumerian king list W-62 mentions the flood and the flood hero Ziusudra. The king list has impossibly large numbers of years for each king, but these numbers are deciphered in chapter 7 of this book. Numerous other ancient versions of the flood story were studied in preparing the present book, including Old Testament, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Rabbinic traditions, Muslim traditions, Greek myths, Hindu myths, etc. These do not appear to add any usable legend to the Sumerian Babylonian flood story. And then here, common phrases imply common origin. Distinctive story elements and phrases that are common to two or more of these 6 stories indicate a common origin. Parallel quotations make it obvious that these 6 flood stories did not originate independently. They're all here, all listed here. And there's more here. And here uses Noah. With Noah. And here's an interesting one. I lived in the temple of Ea, my lord. That's one of a pantheon of gods, right? Atrahasis RS 22.421.7. Why I was saying it's something to look at is because you have the Aramaic name for Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, Joshua, right? So it could be where it came from, maybe. We don't know that. Only a native born Aramaic speaker like Victor and Alexander would understand if that's related to that, right? That Joshua or Ea is related to that. Ea, here. Know what with God, Genesis 6:9c. Is that in the Berossus or the Greek account? Flood story originated about 2900 BC. The above parallels are so numerous and unmistakably similar that it should be obvious that these versions have literary affinity, if not dependency. Directly or indirectly, these 6 stories had a common source or sources and are surviving editions of the same story. According to archaeologist Max Mallowan, this flood story originated in the early dynastic 1 period, about 2900 to 2800 BC. After that, hundreds of years passed before the art of syllabic writing was sufficiently developed for this archetype flood story to be written in narrative form. After the oral tradition was written in clay, the written archetype story was re-edited into at least 6 written versions in which the same mundane events were mythologized and interpreted differently. Although the hero in these 6 versions was given different names, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Noah, Suthros, and Suthros, they are the same person because it is the same story. Therefore, the name Noah, or the Babylonian Noah, or even the Palestinian Ne'ah, or the Sumerian Noah will be used for the in this book for the flood hero throughout this book, regardless of the source of the story. Element being discussed, although the name Ziusudra is usually implied. This is done for convenience and is not intended as an endorsement of every fanciful action attributed to the biblical Noah or his Babylonian counterparts. It had been suggested that the name Noah, this is before it had vowels, right? The Masoretic text, Masoretes, they added the vowels, right? Supposedly so you could, beginners, etc., could say it better, right? It was easier to say. Yeah, so originally the Aramaic and the Hebrew, the Tav Asherit and the Tav Ivri, didn't have vowels. They might have had an A, but it wasn't considered a vowel, it was considered a consonant. So this name Noah, N-W-H, originally meant long, as in long life. The literal meaning of Ziusudra, Zisuthros and Kisiuthros are Greekized forms of Ziusudra. Well, yeah, you can see that because they've got the os on the end, right? Each of the 6 versions of this flood story include details that are not found in the other versions, thus indicating that each version is not wholly derived from one or the other versions. The following are examples of significant details found in one version that are not found in the other versions, and they're all listed here. And a thunderstorm caused flooding in the Euphrates Valley. According to Gilgamesh 11, 97 to 109, there arose a black cloud from the horizon, thundering within it. For one whole day the south wind blew, gathering speed, tore out the dam posts, made the dikes overflow. These lines clearly indicate that Noah's flood was caused by a heavy thunderstorm that caused flooding which breached the dams and levees. This flood was probably unusual in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, but need not have been unique or even rare. Torrential floods are endemic to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and an overflow of the Tigris in 1954 submerged the low-lying plain for hundreds of miles, threatening Baghdad with destruction. So, as we believe we mentioned earlier, we have a book called The Timetables of History, the new third revised edition by Bernard Grun, translated from Werner Stein's Culture Farplan, and it says these disastrous floods happened in that Mesopotamian region at a certain date indicated. Many disastrous floods happened in that region, as stated within this book. In the Sumerian king list for cities in the southern Euphrates Valley, after the name of the flood hero and his city Shuruppak are the words "the flood swept there over," followed by the names of more kings in the southern valley. In Gilgamesh 1135, the flood hero was also placed at Shuruppak, the modern Farah in the southern Euphrates Valley. This suggests a specific historical flood that took place in the southern Euphrates River Valley. Malawan discussed several historical floods in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and unusual alluvial strata that were deposited in various cities. Malawan also discussed the question of which these strata can be identified with the King List flood and the Genesis flood. Further discussion of this issue can be found in Reichs and Bailey, must be their book, right, on that. Criticisms of attempts to identify Noah's flood with one or another of these historical floods have focused on the fact that none of these local floods affected all of the excavated cities at the same time. But if Noah's flood did not submerge all of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, then the story may have been inspired by one of the local historical floods that submerged some but not all of the cities in the valley. Unusual alluvial strata were found at nearly contemporaneous levels during excavation of Shuruppak, Uruk, the earliest level at Kish, and possibly Lagash. These strata were deposited about 2900 BC, and according to Malawan, may have resulted from the flood of the King List and Genesis flood. This flood deposited about 60 centimetres of yellow sediments in Shuruppak, a city where Utnapishtim, Noah lived, according to Gilgamesh 1135. The alluvial stratum from this flood was found directly above a polychrome jar. Seal cylinders and stamp seals from the Jemdet Nesar period, which is that Uruk 3, and directly below plano-convex bricks from the early dynastic period, which followed the Jemdet Nasar period. According to radiocarbon dating, the early dynastic period began about 2900 BC. Being a old book, maybe published in about 1967 or something like that. After that, there probably were people that studied they studied radiocarbon, etc. And they worked out, it's not as reliable, etc., etc. So take note of that. This is probably some people that just say, you're radiocarbon dating, no, it's no good, or this has been proven rubbish, or this and stuff, right? Or ineffective, or whatever. A similar stratum of sterile alluvial sediment 5 feet deep was excavated at Uruk by Jordan, who dated it to the beginning of the 3rd millennium. Some other archaeologists probably. BC, or about the same time as the Shuruppak stratum. The flood of 2900 BC that deposited sediment at Uruk and Shuruppak was the flood most likely to have inspired the Genesis story. This was at the beginning of the early dynastic 1 period and was about the same time as the first dynasty of Egypt, 200 years before the pyramid builders. So they were probably still making those mounds when this thing went down. Unusual alluvial strata have also been found at Ur and Nineveh, but these sediments were deposited more than 600 years earlier, about 4000 to 3500 BC, and interrupted the Ubaid period. Woolley, another archaeologist, who excavated Ur, thought he had discovered evidence of Noah's flood, but he was mistaken about this according to Malawan. At Kish, 4 flood strata were found. The earliest of these identified with the kingless flood lay directly above the Jemdet Nasa stratum. The yellow flood stratum at Shuruppak was also directly above the Jemdet Nasa stratum. The archaeologist's record supports a dating of the flood mentioned in the Sumerian king list, Noah's flood, at the end of the Jemdet Nasa period, about 2900 BC. Some scholars date the king list flood at the end of the early dynastic 1 period, ED1, about 2750 BC, because according to the king list, the flood was followed by a new dynasty at Kish, which is accepted as beginning the early dynastic 2 ED or ED2 period. However, the Kish dynasty need not have come immediately after the king list flood, especially as the ED1 kings are unknown and may have been missing in the king list, and so forth. It would not be surprising if a major river flood destroyed kilns, potters' wheels, tools and supplies used by producers of polychrome pottery, see example on front cover, thereby providing an opportunity for competitors whose manufacturing operations were left undamaged by the flood to take over the pottery market with a different design after the flood. A major river flood is more consistent with a culture break at the end of the Jemdet Nasa period than with a gradual transition between ED1 and ED2. According to Malawan, the Genesis flood was based on a real event which may have occurred in about 2900 BC, or perhaps a century or more after, at the beginning of the early dynastic period. A Sumerian document known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, dated by Kramer about 2500 BC, refers in a later version to Ziusudra, or Noah. Kramer concluded that Ziusudra had become a venerable figure in literary tradition by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Kramer agrees with Malawan that the Mesopotamian flood story was inspired by an actual catastrophic but by no means universal disaster, so it wasn't global disaster, it was just in that region, as we stated about the timetables of history, saying there's disastrous floods in the Mesopotamian region at a certain date in time. It is widely assumed that Noah's flood must have been of great magnitude to have survived in the world's literature for thousands of years. So it must have been a big event and affected lots, right? But it was not the magnitude of the flood that made the story memorable. Noah's flood was remembered primarily because a man and his family happened to survive it in a way that made an interesting story that people retold to their friends and relatives. For thousands of years, storytellers repeated this flood story because their listeners wanted to hear about the flood hero. Early Sumerian and Babylonian literature frequently referred to this flood and the man who built a boat in which he saved some animals and his family. So it's very popular, so it's repeated and repeated. Someone will say, oh, I want to hear that story about this guy. Tell us that story. And be repeated over and over again over the centuries, right? Or the ages, the years to follow. Noah, king of Shuruppak. Noah lived at a time when most of the population was involved with agriculture and farm animals. Noah probably had many years of experience with animals, but he was not a mere shepherd or cattle rancher. In the Ziusudra version of the flood story, the Sumerian Noah is repeatedly called a king or chief, Lugab. According to the Vald Blundell King List, WB 62. Ziusudra, or Noah, was king of the city-state Shuruppak. Lugal literally means great man and was normally a young man of outstanding qualities from a rich land-owning family. The flood hero was a respected leader who spoke to, quote, the city people and the elders, unquote, of Shuruppak, according to Gilgamesh XL or XI, that would be 11:35, and Atrahasis 3:39-41. In the WB-62 king list, Ziusudra, or Noah, succeeded his father Su-Kurlam as king of Shuruppak. Su-Kurlam was probably Lamech, Noah's father, Genesis 5:28-31. The flood of 2900 BC deposited sediment in Shuruppak directly above artifacts from the Jim-det-Nsa period. Hence, the flood hero was probably chief executive of Shuruppak during the end of the Jim-det-Nsa period, and that the flood story began to circulate during the early dynastic I period that followed the flood. Shuruppak was then a capital city and a commercial centre located on the Euphrates River. As head of the Shuruppak city-state government, Noah was probably a wealthy landowner. Wealthy people then invested in cattle, and so apparently did Noah. A clue to what he did with his animals is found in Gilgamesh 11:81-82. All I had of silver I loaded, all I had of gold I had loaded into the boat. In earliest records, silver was used as an index of value for other commodities, but prior to minting of standard weight coins in the 7th century BC, silver and gold were not a common medium of exchange and were used largely by professional merchants and those involved in caravan trade. Most people in Sumer use cups or bowls of barley as the common medium of exchange. Okay, we probably will create a part 2 to this video, so subscribe to us, give us a like, add your comments, and you go share this video with your family, friends and others who may really want to know if the biblical Noah story is true or it's fictional, where did it originate from originally, so they may be interested in watching this particular video. Don't forget to come back and watch part 2. Look for part 2 if we make it, which we probably will, because this is very interesting, where we strive to bring the evidence to you, to all, that it was first a mythical story and it was adopted and adapted over the millenniums, centuries, and became this historical story of a global flood, etc., etc., taught in your local churches, temples, etc. We are the Ministry of the Truth, and thank you for taking the time to watch this, our latest video upload.